Everyone to CGHE seminar number 207, and today we have with us Jana Kleibert from the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space and the Humboldt-University of Berlin. So tremendous to have Jana with us. I'll introduce her in a moment. Let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded. All that you say in the chat and on screen will be recorded for all time. It'll be up there on YouTube. It'll be up there on our website in 24 hours or 48 hours or so. And the chat will be there as well. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but when we get to the Q&A stage and you're asked to ask your question, it's a good idea to turn it on then. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. To ask a question, use the chat function, write out your question, and I'll select the Q&A participants on the basis of what's coming forward. I usually select on the basis of relevance to the presentation. So if you ask a question that's focused on what Jana is saying, then you're likely to get in the Q&A. And also timing. If you come in early, you'll get in the Q&A with a relevant question. If you come in the last 5-10 minutes with a stupefying, brilliant question, it might miss out because we've already composed the call list by then. When you're invited to ask your question in the chat, in the Q&A, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Well, thanks for putting that up on screen, Trevor. We're now into the substantive part of the webinar, and pleasure to welcome Jana Kleibert. She's an economic geographer. Her focus is on globalization, constructions of the knowledge economy, and urban spaces. So when we're talking about space, we're not talking about outer space research. We're talking about space in its material, spatial, and theoretical, discursive, imagined form. She is leading a research group on constructing transnational spaces of higher education, which has been looking at the offshoring of higher education. Jana received her doctorate from the University of Amsterdam. Jana, welcome to the CG webinar, and the screen is now yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks also for the kind introduction. I'll share my screen now with you.
Yes, thank you. And we can see that. That's good.
So I hope you can all see the title page now. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to present some of my ideas in this format. As Simon said, I'm not an expert on higher education per se, or I'm not from within the discipline of higher education, let's say. But I'm rather an economic geographer and urban geographer, and this is the lens and the perspective I bring to an issue which I believe is of interest for this webinar today. And I'll focus on the empirical phenomenon of education cities, or also education hubs. But what I will argue here and present here is a new conceptual lens, if you like, on how to understand certain types of these empirical phenomena. And that is the lens of transnational education zones. And my argument will be that this kind of conceptualization allows for an understanding of some of the logics and also some of the contradictions and tensions that are inherent in these sites. Now, if we think of universities, of higher education institutions and their relation to space, to their surroundings, to different parts of the world, generally we think of them as fairly local actors, or we thought of them as fairly local actors, and they're very much embedded within places, usually within cities. And as you can see here, in just one logo of a university from the University of Bologna, you can also see how they've been attached to a specific place over time, which hasn't changed very much, which has remained fairly stable, this relationship between the place and the origin of university and its location. But of course, now we can see, and this is just one of many examples, how universities have become stretched and have become transnational actors that are active across a number of different regions and scales. And of course, knowledge has always been highly mobile. So even in the example of the University of Bologna, students were, of course, international, staff, the faculty members were international. But the phenomenon I'm interested here and speak about today is universities, so the institutions themselves becoming transnational actors and becoming mobile. And this calls for an understanding, and colleagues have argued before me, to look at universities across different scales and sites and see them as global players who are highly influential beyond their immediate locale, while exhibiting a significant capacity to affect the social, spatial, and symbolic structures of metropolis. So that means we need to understand universities as actors in cities, which is like a very large literature, looking at the relations between universities and cities, usually focuses on universities in their cities of origin, but not necessarily on the effects of universities once they change their location. And the second part of literature from my field of economic geography has also primarily looked at the local effects of universities, of the regional effects, such as spillovers and innovation, usually measured through econometric analysis, the effects that knowledge creation in higher education institutions and university has on the immediate surroundings. So this should just serve as an introduction. And my outline for today, the talk I want to give is based in 3 parts. So first, I talk a bit about the geographies of offshore campuses, so of the phenomenon of higher education institutions moving abroad and offering their degrees through physical presences abroad. The second part will focus on the transnational education zones as the conceptual lens that I suggest. And the third part looks at some of the logics of these places, but also the contradictions inherent within them. This research isn't simply based on my own work, but this is part of a larger project that Simon already mentioned in the beginning. So the junior research group Constructing Transnational Spaces of Higher Education that I lead since 2018. And with me in the project are 3 PhD students, Tim Rottleb, Alice Bobée, and Marc Schulze. And the project is situated in between economic and urban geography, and we take a cultural political economy perspective. So we focus on the material, but also the discursive constructions of offshore campuses. To break it down, we're interested in basically 2 questions. The first question is, why do universities become transnational actors? Why do they set up campuses offshore? And this, I will bracket a bit for this talk, because the second question is, how are these offshore campuses then embedded within strategies of national governments and of also city regions? So how are they embedded within the ambitions of host governments? And this is the second question is what I want to focus on today. So if there's later any questions on the first issue, I'm happy to discuss them. But the focus here is really on understanding from an economic, geographic, and urban geographic perspective where universities go, why they go where they go, and what the effects, sorry, not why they go where they go, but what the effects are of where we actually see these projects happening. The research is based largely on qualitative research. So we've conducted as a team 135 interviews with decision makers and campus managers, primarily in Europe, looking at the sending perspective of institutions. And the focus of today, of course, is the transnational education zones or cities, so the places where these campuses land. And here we've looked at Malaysia, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. before we started the empirical fieldwork, we tried to map the phenomenon. So as geographers, we try to produce a map of where is the phenomenon visible that we're interested in. And for this, we set up a database of offshore campuses. And we found close to 500 of these types of campuses throughout the world. And according to, and so we could see within that some of the geographies popping up again that have already been shown in previous studies. But what I think is different from our report was a focus on cities, or zooming in below the nation state level, and not just looking at it on a country by country basis, but really trying to understand which cities do offshore campuses locate in. So here you can see the report. You can also download it if you're interested in some of the more detailed analysis of the histories and the geographies of offshore campuses on the basis of our database. But what you can see here in this graph, in this figure, sorry, is in blue where offshore campuses are located in, and the red parts you can ignore for now. This is the places where higher education institutions come from that set up offshore campuses. Now, if we look at this map, a number of places are maybe not very surprising, and for many of you who are familiar with the topic, they might be even less surprising. So you see a number of global cities, you could say. You see Shanghai, you see Singapore. But what I find interesting, that there's also a number, we see clusters of offshore campuses, also in a number of places that aren't usually on the map of global cities. For instance, Flic-en-Flac in Mauritius. And so what I'm interested in is exploring at more depth why we see these formations of clusters, and understanding those not necessarily as spontaneously formed clusters, but as related to government strategies. Now, if we zoom in to some of these sites, what I would call transnational education zones, this is what we can see. So to give you some examples, empirical examples, this is Education City in Qatar. It's one of the first of these projects. It started in 2001, and it's heavily financed by the Qatar Foundation, or it's facilitated by the Qatar Foundation, and it's also financed by the state of Qatar, and has managed to attract quite a number of institutions, particularly from the United States, but also from the UK. And they offer a variety of degrees, including medicine and journalism from the Education City, which is based just outside of Doha. Another example comes from Dubai. So it's called Dubai International Academic City. And this is one of two transnational education zones within the Emirate of Dubai. And it was started in 2007. And here you can see a variety of different higher education providers, largely also from quite a different background from the ones in Qatar. So you can see different types of institutions, not primarily from the US, but more often from the UK, Australia, but also places like India or Pakistan. And the focus of these study programs is largely on business studies. This is much less financed by the Emirate of Dubai, but it's rather a policy that enables foreign direct investment within these particular zones. And together, these two zones, so Dubai International Academic City and Dubai Knowledge Park, together have about 27,000 students. I want to share a third and final example with you. And this is Edu City in Iskandar, Malaysia. which has been running for more than 10 years now. It's a project of the national government and partially financed through government investment fund. And this is located in the state of Johor, at the very south of Malaysia, and just across the border to Singapore. And here we can see three British universities who have set up within the zone. So just from these three examples, you can see a number of similarities. They all advertise themselves as education cities. So they all use the name in some form or another. Many of them discursively also link to smart cities or sustainable cities in a way. They're usually national government projects that are embedded in ideas about creating education hubs and also transforming into the knowledge economy. Of course, we can also see differences between these projects. But I'm interested now in kind of thinking through how we can make sense of these quite particular forms of clusters of offshore campuses. And when we look in the literature, these are usually seen either as education cities or as education hubs. And this is one of the books edited by Jay Knight on international education hubs. And here the definition is a planned effort to build a critical mass of local and international actors strategically engaged in cross-border education, training, knowledge production, and innovation activities. So you can see this is quite a broad definition under which these kinds of projects are brought together. And the idea is here that it's not very clear at which scale we're talking about education hubs that exist. So a range of education hubs are then identified and discussed in the literature. But it is a bit unclear whether it's the aspiration of actually constructing an education hub or the existence of certain indicators that will make a country, a city, or a region be part of the analysis. So usually this can be entire countries such as Malaysia, but also Botswana or Bahrain have been counted as international education hubs. One of the issues here is that by using the term education city or education hub, it might lead to reproducing the self-ascribed terminology that is largely aspirational or in some cases promotional language. And in order to understand and zoom into the specific phenomenon that I'm interested in, I want to link it more closely to ideas of special economic zones that we know of in the literature from economic geography, and think it through think these places as transnational education zones. And so different from the definition given earlier on education hubs, which is much more broader, much more encompassing, taking on a whole range of different places. The focus here is really not on the spontaneous agglomeration, but on planned investment zones that have been created. And the definition here is that they are in a territorially defined area. So this cannot be across the entire nation state, but it needs to be a segregated, territorially defined area, usually at the urban scale. In order for it to be a transnational education zone, there need to be at least 2 offshore campuses. There needs to be shared campus infrastructure. These places advertise themselves as an education hub or city. So this is part of the definition. And the zones should have higher education as a primary function. And when we use this, you can see here again some of the places that I already showed to you earlier. And we can see these kind of places as transnational education zones. Now, the idea, of course, here is not simply to map an existing phenomenon in slightly more detail than before, or just introduce another fancy term for what we're looking at. But my aim is really to make apparent the logics that guide these kind of very specific form of higher education and transnational education clusters. And I believe the idea of transnational education zones and an urban political economy analysis can give us more insights into looking at these kinds of projects together. So first, I would classify them as urban state-led projects that are always intended or linked in some form or another, at least discursively, with ideas of building a knowledge-based economy. So they're embedded within broader economic, sometimes also social visions, and they're strategic national economic development projects that often materialize at the urban scale and that often lead to urban transformations. Beyond the discursive reference to the knowledge economy, there's also the reference often to smart cities or to urban transformations. The second part that this lens allows us to see is to understand these places really as zones of exception. And this is where the literature from economic geography I find quite helpful, because the idea of introducing zones, carving out spaces for foreign direct investment and for plugging into global value chains and networks is something that we can also see here within these zones. So they differ in terms of their contexts, in terms of the exact definition, the exact exemptions they grant. But usually we can see some sort of differential jurisdiction from the national territory. So these regulatory exemptions could take different shapes, but they include, for instance, eased accreditation procedures or even a different form of accreditation of degrees. They can include tax exemptions or eased visa procedures for staff. They may also include relatively less restrictions on academic freedom. So by carving out these spaces, different regulatory measures can exist that are distinct from the national territory surrounding. And usually what we can also observe here is a process of rescaling. So the authority and decision-making powers in some instances are shifted from the national state and, let's say, higher education authorities and departments that would usually be responsible for accreditation might not be involved in these places, and much more power is given to zone authorities. Again, this differs from place to place, but I think the lens enables us to look at these differences in more detail and understand why we can see these kinds of places. A third part is that these transnational education zones are also sites of transnational subject formation. So they are intended as projects for economic and social transformation. So the idea that international degrees deliver a different kind of status, but also knowledge for domestic populations, but can also serve to attract internationally mobile students. And these can be seen as elite projects, of course, and some of which are very much based on transnational mobilities. However, they can also be used in a way to attract and keep a rather disembedded migrant labor force within a place. Now, these kinds of transnational education zones are not without tensions and are not without contradictions. While most of them aim to become a knowledge hub or an innovation hub, we can see different kinds of contradictions occurring. The first one, and these are very general contradictions. The first one is one between rationale and outcome. So whereas governments try to use these projects as strategic projects for building the knowledge-based economy. The way how this should actually work in practice is not very clear. And so, of course, this is always a difficult process. But here, I think one of the key challenges to achieve the kind of outcomes that we associate with having universities within a particular region, and these ideas usually come from studies that focus on the effects of universities on the urban environments, or also on regional economic development that I mentioned very much at the beginning. These kind of studies are based on the countries of origin and the regions of origin of the universities. But something changes once we look at offshore campuses, and that is that most of these are not full-fledged university offering the entire range of programs that they offer at home or have the same size. But usually these are quite small in terms of the scope of their activities and also in terms of the number of students they educate. But it's not simply the size, it's also the types of activities that are usually offshored. And here we tend to see quite a decoupling of the research and the teaching functions that are usually combined within universities. And I think this decoupling of simply relocating teaching functions of universities, of course, jeopardizes some of the ideas of building a knowledge-based economy if the idea is to build it around the idea of innovation and spillovers that would occur through research-related functions of universities. A second tension, I would say, is the one between competition and collaboration within and beyond the zones. So, of course, governments try to set up these zones as ways to further economic development. So there might be a difference between the interests of the state and then the interest of the private sector, but there's also a difference between the domestic and foreign investors coming in. So for the foreign universities, a key motivation may be to build reputation, but also often to increase revenue. And in order to increase revenue, the programs that need to be offered need to be as cost effective as possible. So in a sense, they need to generate revenue. Often this is done in partnership with domestic capital. And a lot of these institutions that partner with offshore campuses are actually not in the field of higher education, but are rather from other sectors, maybe conglomerates, domestic conglomerates, real estate firms, and so on. So here there's of course competition between the goals and also for the resources available occurring. The third tension, and this one I would say is not unique to transnational education hubs or zones, but is something that we see basically in most systems that aim to draw income from students. And when higher education is seen and conceptualized as an export revenue sector that is dependent on the inflow of international students, this can lead to tensions with existing migration regimes and immigration rules. And this is something that we saw as a contradiction also emerging around the idea of these transnational education zones, because on the one hand, they should bring in international students, but then this needs to be decided again on the level of the nation state. This is not a decision that has been rescaled to zone authorities, and this is where conflicts between the goals can emerge. And finally, the fact that these are zones of exception also make it harder to achieve the goal of an overall knowledge economy, because they remain spatially segregated and often disconnected from national education systems, and in some instances are used also to reproduce a sort of disembedded labor force in the process. So this makes it harder for the effects of the zone and the larger ambitions that they should bring to be realized. I'll end with a very brief conclusion. There's of course a number of things we could discuss further, but what I hope to have shown is that with the concept of the zone, we can highlight the strategic planning, the exceptional character, and also the kind of disembedded or enclave nature of some of these projects. And I hope to have highlighted some of the logics, but also the tensions and contradictions within them. And we could think now much further about what that means for higher education institutions and their relation to their spatial surroundings in the future. There's 3 ideas for future research. I mean, I tried now to weave together more the similarities, and so I brushed over the differences between these projects. And I think a situated analysis based on the specific political economic context of these zones would be very fruitful to situate them also within their colonial histories. A second question would be to look at the mobilities of the concept of transnational education zones, because we can see how more and more states are trying to set up these projects, including Egypt now and Saudi Arabia. So how is this idea of these zones traveling and changing through time and space? And thirdly, we could, of course, wonder about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on sites of transnational higher education. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
And you're going to have one, Jana, because in the last 5 minutes, a lot of questions have suddenly appeared in the chat. I'm going to ask you one first. I mean, there's an underlying paradox, isn't there? These many governments, as you say, look at this and do it and actually go through with it, create these special zones. And the paradox is, of course, that they seek to make international connections. They seek to open their economies to international relationships. And at the same time, they then disconnect these zones with their domestic economy and politics and culture. I mean, how much transformation really does take place in the domestic, national, economic, political, and cultural environment? Do you have a sense of that coming out of your research?
Thank you. Fascinating question. That touches upon sort of the circulation and the containment aspects of these zones. I think when I was looking for effects in specific environments, what struck me as being maybe one of the effects that we don't tend to see immediately, but that seems to be in economic terms quite strong, is what all these zones do is that they brand places, and places become visible and seen. So there is a clear effect, I would say, that, I mean, I haven't measured, but just looking at the phenomenon that you can see in terms of real estate development, further investments coming in. And so in that sense, we do see a difference that these projects make. I'm less sure about the difference they make in terms of human capital development or in collaboration with domestic higher education institutions, for instance. And I would imagine, since many of these campuses, the offshore campuses themselves, are rather small, these effects will not be very large.
Right, yes, and the paradox then I think is still there. Now, I'm going to take the questions in order, and I'll get in touch with questioners as we go a bit, but the first 3 will be David Mills, Miguel Lim, and Phil Altbach. So David, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you, Jana. That was really fascinating. A great sort of mapping of the situation. My question is really around one of the tensions you had identified, which is that the aspiration to this sort of broader understanding of the zone as building knowledge, innovation, training, and then the reality of whether it's primarily about teaching and student numbers, because I see UCL stopped its Qatar link last year. So clearly there are many universities that are rethinking some of this. And obviously COVID changes that debate again. And so they're probably, reinvigorates the case for it. But I just wonder whether you want to comment on the relationship between whether research is the aspiration, but teaching is the reality.
This is an interesting, shall I answer immediately? Or do we take 3 questions?
No, I think we'll take the one-to-one at this point.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Sorry. This is an interesting question. I think the number one reason why universities actually drop out, so I didn't talk about their motivation now, is that they often underestimate the costs, and they underestimate or they overestimate the number of students that will enroll in these projects. So often for universities, the whole calculation is based around tuition fees, and this is based around the numbers of students they can attract. And often governments and private sector actors are aiming to boost these figures in order to make it a very attractive claim. And this is also part of the knowledge or the language that I try to critique a little bit here, of branding something as an education hub, as long as there's just simply the aspiration to become one. I think whether research is the ambition and teaching is the reality, I'm not fully sure if research is even the ambition, but it sort of becomes mixed up in the idea of building a knowledge-based economy, looking at studies that prove the effect of research-based innovation at campus's origins, and then thinking this will happen through undergraduate degree teaching elsewhere. This is kind of where I see a contradiction and a bit of a mismatch.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
So Miguel, I'm Miguel Lim.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you so much for the talk. Great stuff. I just had a question about earlier on in the talk, you mentioned the practice of academic freedom in these zones of exception, and I think these kind of ideas go together well. Could you just talk more concretely about those cases where this zone is exceptional and different in the way that academic freedom is practiced in the rest of the country? I think there is talk in, for instance, higher education journals about cases in China, but for instance, setting up branch campuses and issues about academic freedom and censorship there, but perhaps not much about perhaps these other zones that you've been speaking about in the presentation. So I would be particularly interested to hear as well about those cases. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very hard actually from this economic geographic research to make large claims on academic freedom. So we tried to look for this, but it's hard to find. I think one, and it's not so black and white. So it's not that there's government regulation that says these are all the things you're not supposed to do or say on campus. And then within these zones, everything is allowed, for instance. So it's not that black and white. But what we do see is that a number of the zones, particularly in the Arab Gulf states, do see themselves and are intended to be slightly more liberal than the surroundings. And also government officials or stakeholders, let's say, in the region actually see them as sort of segregated areas outside of the cities, that those practices will not spill over so fast. So this could relate not simply just to academic freedom, but to social relations more broadly, to gender relations on campus, for instance. And so these tend to be seen as more liberal spaces. And colleagues who work in political science have looked more closely on the political dimensions of these campuses. So this is where I would see a connection to debates on academic freedom through the zone as a spatial structure.
It's a major research issue, isn't it, really, and requires another data collection process. Phil Altbach is next.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. This is a topic on which I've done actually some research of my own and have observed it for a long time. And so my thoughts are just bursting a little bit. And I just like to raise a number of points which you can respond to or not. A few questions, but some comments too. I think that the research mission of almost all branch campuses and almost all education hubs is a non-starter. It's just not going to happen. I mean, it might occur in a few specialized areas, but research is expensive, as we all know, and the purpose of the sponsoring institutions is by and large not research, but teaching, as you have correctly pointed out. A related point is the home faculty doesn't teach, generally speaking, at the branch campuses. People are hired from the local area sometimes or internationally among an increasing and very interesting group, one which is totally unresearched but needs attention, of kind of faculty members who sort of go from one branch campus to another branch campus and create a kind of career being academic nomads in that way, maybe partly stimulated by the bad job market in many countries, but it's really quite fascinating. You've pointed out, I think correctly, but probably it needs more emphasis, that the purpose of most branch campuses is to make money for all involved. And all involved not only means the sponsoring institutions, but from an economic geography point of view, a lot of these are in Malaysia, for example, built by property companies who want to have a prestige institution on their new shopping mall area or housing development or something. And I think that is worth looking at more. The China model is, of course, quite fascinating because China insists that all of its foreign collaborating institutions, branch campuses, if you will, have a Chinese partner that has real power over both the internal and the broader management and concept of the institution, and how that works and what that means. I thought in your presentation, and you might want to comment about this a little bit more, how and I think Simon brought it up too, how do the branch campuses affect the local areas, the academic systems, but also just the geographical areas in which they're located? Because I think that's, Singapore, for example, has been very much interested in that. And of course, some branch campuses have failed for the reasons that you mentioned, that is, they haven't been able to earn enough money. And some have been kicked out by the sponsoring governments or institutions. Singapore is a very good example there, where they find that the branches are not up to quality standards or not doing what both sides have intended them to do. They are given their, in typical Singapore style, their walking papers pretty quickly. So that's more than enough. Sorry to take the time, but the fascinating topic that really deserves more, more research. And I'm really glad you and others like Jane Knight and some others have started working on this.
Thank you very much for all these comments. And I mean, they speak of the decades of experience you have in this field. I'll take most of them down as points to note, but I want to react on maybe one of the issues you raised, which is about the partnership agreements between offshore campuses and then their domestic partners. And to me, what is interesting, or what I found interesting when I read the existing literature, that often, whether it was academic partners or business partners, kind of became conflated So it was either offshore campuses as standalone or offshore campuses with partners. And to my understanding, it makes a huge difference whether it is a research intensive domestic university, like in the pairing agreement with Chinese institutions, or whether it is actually a property developer that has nothing to do with higher education otherwise. And I do think that offshore campuses, this depends again on broader regulations on foreign direct investments, and also this is very much embedded to existing structures of the political economy and the landscapes. But I do think that that makes a huge difference, what kind of partnerships are activated and are sort of also encouraged and stimulated by the government. And one thing I read about Malaysia, for instance, is you said, well, they're not there to do any research, but there's now the idea that offshore campuses can actually have access to research funding if they pair with a domestic Malaysian higher education institution. So in this sense, there are, of course, levers in order to encourage research. And I agree, I don't think this has been the key concern for many of these projects or the states. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, but yeah, thank you so much for the points you raised.
Yeah, thank you both. That was a really interesting exchange and clearly could go on for a little bit longer. We'll follow the logic you suggested, Jana, and we'll take some bracketed questions now so we can get through our question list before the end of the webinar. So we'll take 3, and the first of those 3 is going to be David Law. So hold your response until you've heard all 3 questions. David.
Thank you, Simon. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Jana. My question is about China, and it's really related conceptually to the issue of how large can a TNE zone be. As you move away from the idea of education city to a TNE zone, it brings up the issue of what kind of territorial integrity and range of space does a zone have? And I'm thinking in particular about Shenzhen, and from Shenzhen, the Greater Bay Area. Shenzhen's very interesting in my view, because it's the location for a number of branch campuses. Branch campuses, incidentally, from Chinese universities as well as overseas universities. Of course, it's the location for the collaboration between Moscow State University and Beijing Institute of Technology, which has legal person status. It's the location for links between Hong Kong universities under the Joint Education Program, Joint Education Institute. And I was also thinking about the kind of campuses that some of the Beijing universities have in Shenzhen, where they share infrastructure. We talk about transnational education, but actually China, as a huge country, we might think about outreach activity, dispersed delivery activity. Is a Beijing university that operates in Guangzhou operating on a TNE basis, or not definitionally, but actually in many respects, it resembles a TNE operation. So it's about the kind of territorial space that you would define as necessary within a TNE zone.
Thanks, David. You did quite well with your question opportunity there.
Yeah, 1 or 2.
Can we bring in Lee Rensimer? Lee.
Okay, thanks. I think my question pairs with David's quite closely. So the question I proffered is a lengthy one, and I think if I summed it up, it would be: is there a difference for you conceptually between TNE zones and TNE hubs and just, let's say, concentrations of TNE in a particular territory? And the reason I ask that is because I'm thinking of, well, the way you've conceptualized things as very top down and having an explicit state purpose of a knowledge economy. If I look at Qatar, that certainly is the case in the way it was planned in a very strategic upfront way with those drivers in mind. But then if I contrast that with Dubai and Ras Al Khaimah, both of them developed as economic spaces of exception that allowed universities to establish themselves through business licenses. And they were businesses just as any other in the zone were for quite a long time, until those zones became more and more refined, subdivided. They were then given a regulatory body like the CGHE in Dubai. But those things developed later on. And so initially they were just concentrations of T&E for quite some time. And that is still the case in Ras Al Khaimah. It's not really a top-down zone with any rationales that are tightly linked to the emirate development.
Thanks, Lee. Hong Bui. Hong.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana and Simon. My questions here is that I'm keen to know the view from policymakers of the host countries. I just wonder whether they're happy with the T&E or they're not, because it linked back to the case of Malaysia. Initially, they invited partnerships because they, in Malaysia's Malaysian student could go to public university, but Chinese students couldn't. They have to go to private. So Chinese students in Malaysia in 1990s had to go overseas to studies. But because of the finance crisis, so the government tried to stop the currency brains to foreign countries. So they invite university, particularly in the UK, to set up campus in order to stop the currency flows out of the country. But now it seems that Malaysians, now the government is not very supportive to those T&E. You know, that's those early findings that I've heard recently. So that's why I'm keen on, do you have any data and analysis related to policymakers in those host countries? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Hong. And I think perhaps at this point, we best bring Jana in before she gets too many questions to answer at once. Jana.
Okay, thank you for these fascinating questions, and there could be, I could give very long answers, but I tried to condense it and be short. And I think to summarize at least two of the questions is like where to draw the boundaries and where to draw the borders. And maybe that's also the answer. I was specifically interested in the phenomenon of bordering, of making these zones stand out as territorial entities within which activities are different from outside, and that sort of are territorially bounded in a way, and trying to understand those specific phenomena. To the question of China, of course, and Shenzhen is in the literature on special economic zones one of the key examples, because it kind of changed the entire way we think about special economic zones as like industrial complexes that were designed for companies to set up in and then produce for global markets, manufacturing, assembly, and so on. And Shenzhen became a model as an entire city that developed into such a zone. And so so China blew the proportions in a way with how we think about these zones. And so then, of course, you could change the definition, or you look at other things again. But I just thought it was interesting to zoom in on one very specific element to understand this more clearly. So the other point about Beijing University setting up campuses or engagement elsewhere, I think it's hugely interesting to look at international campuses, international branch campuses and domestic branch campuses together, and look at whether they constitute actually related strategies or different ones. And I just wrote a paper on that on the case of the UK, because we can see that in London there's a major concentration of domestic branch campus as well as international branch campuses. And I think for the UK, we can see these as related strategies, but in other contexts, I wouldn't know, and I couldn't say for the case of China. I think, yeah, so the idea was not to look at spontaneous agglomerations, but really as sort of government incentivized spatial concentrations through the zones. Are policymakers happy? Depends, I would say. I think there are some projects that haven't turned out the way that they were intended to go. And I think in those cases, where you can see that student numbers are very low, institutions leave again. These are usually situations where those attest to the fact that the plans didn't work quite out as intended. The reasons for that might be manifold. So it could be ambitions that are hard to translate into reality. There are a number of reasons. So I think it depends on the contexts that we look at.
Well done, very economical too. Now I'm going to bring in another three, and if we're really lucky and our questions are short, we might squeeze in Enzo Ramo as well. But Aki Yanazawa is the first. Aki.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Lena. My question is that you showed a cluster of the university that is providing the offshore campuses. So that this means that the city that export to other cities. So I'm more interested in the differences between such a kind of old academic cities such as the Boston and the topics of today, the new ones. So is there any substantial differences between the two? That's my question. Thank you.
Next, we hear from Doria Abdallah.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Now, if I could ask about your comment on the spillover effect of those transnational education zones to local universities or local colleges. I live next to Edu City, by the way, so we are reminded by the university to be constantly in touch with the universities within the zone for collaboration. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Doria. And next is Eduardo Ramos.
Yes, hi, thank you, Simon, and thanks, Jana, for a very good presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on any patterns that you may have found in, common either demographic, social, or political structures in places that favor the development of education zones. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. I think we have got time for Enzo. Enzo Ramo, can you come in, please?
Yeah, so very quickly, it's often argued that the main motivation for the home campus in developing offshore campuses is a financially driven one. So some kind of financial dividend to the home campus. But what's the evidence for those campuses actually making a profit, which is then returned and from which the home campus benefits? And if there isn't any such evidence, why are more of these campuses being opened? Thanks, Jana.
Jana, I think it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for these very brief questions. I'll take them one by one, just in the order they came. So the first one was about what is different about existing education hubs or cities like Boston, and now these new kinds of phenomena that we see. And maybe I can briefly share my screen again, because I have one picture that I want to show to you that I think relates to some of the, I don't know if you can see this very well now.
We can.
Okay, so this relates to some of the questions I received about what are the urban effects of these campuses and how do these sites differ. So this is just outside of Edu City. So Doria and Enzo, you might be very familiar with this view. And this is a shot taken very close to Education City and then looking in the other direction. And so you can see here a lot of palm oil farms, and you can also see housing developments. These are marketed as British townhouses. And so I think the idea that these are brands and the British universities are brands that then are brought in order to develop an entire region, I think is fundamentally different from, let's say, Boston that has historically grown as a hub for as a center for education, or let's say in Germany, the University of Heidelberg. So these are, in many cases, what we saw were sort of greenfield investments occurring either outside of cities or started to stimulate new cities. So that just as one image to show, to answer the question, what is different. The question of what kind of demographics favor the development of transnational education zones. I think a key issue would be international mobility of students. So places that have a large number of outwardly mobile students. So that would be the case, for instance, in Malaysia, or where students traditionally have and still go to the UK or to Australia, for instance, to receive degrees. So those are, of course, places where there is already a strong connection of students going abroad for degrees, and then higher education institutions already receive them as international students at home. So this could be one factor. Other than that, the demographics differ. In Qatar, if we talk about gender, it's more female students enrolling, for instance, than male students who tend to go abroad. So there's different factors that are more contextual. The question of why do universities still set up branch campuses if they don't tend to make much money is something I've been trying to understand throughout this entire research project. And I do think that, of course, there's many motivations for universities to set up these campuses. But I also do think that if I compare it to other foreign direct investments, if we're talking not about transnational universities, but transnational service companies, there would be much more due diligence processes beforehand, and the business plans would be, I guess, set up differently. So I do think there is maybe an information asymmetry or expectations that don't really match in many ways, that still that are at play in those scenarios, I would say, where a university goes in with the ambition to make money and then does not end up to actually make money. I think the question the way you framed it was about a transfer of profits. Now, transfer of profits, of course, is not even legal in many cases. So I think in China, it's illegal to export revenue accrued through the branch campuses back home. But of course, there's different ways of how higher education institutions can benefit from that. I just want to mention one report from the Universities UK, I think, and British Council, that looked at how universities use these offshore campuses as ways to attract more students to the home campus. And I think in places where international students' tuition fees matter a lot, that can be a function that does provide revenue and profitability for higher education institutions, even if they may lose some money in the places where they are actually located with their offshore campuses. Again, this would be a much bigger topic to discuss, but thanks for raising the issue.
Yeah, and I want to thank you sincerely for your presentation today. I think it opened up this terrain very effectively for everyone, and that was shown by not only the fact that we got excellent questions and much discussion could come from all of those further, but also the fact that you had 71 people and they more or less stayed into the end. That doesn't often happen in our webinars, and that shows that people really didn't want to leave at all. On the question of, why do universities do it when it doesn't make money? And I've seen this happen repeatedly. When I was in Australia, many Australians, of course, were keenly involved in these kinds of activities. And in the UK, not quite as much, but still plenty of it. And everyone seems to consider it at some point in their prospective planning. I think it's partly about power. It's partly about social and international expression of identity across distances and establishing relationships of influence, which from a distance, which constitute power. I mean, not everything follows a financial logic, and that would lead us to draw the conclusion that the drivers of colonialism and the drivers of this kind of soft neocolonialism are not all that different in some respects. Perhaps the effects are more benign and certainly more voluntary at the other end, but it's not always just about money in the bank. It's it's about people's own life satisfaction from exercising power over others and in relation to others, and in installing their culture elsewhere, and reproducing themselves in other places. Maybe that's not a kind construction, but I think that it's gone beyond the stage of adding to capacity in countries which have capacity. It's no longer necessarily giving education to those who wouldn't otherwise have education. So there's something else at work there. Nonetheless, and there are lots of positive outcomes of international activity of all kinds, including this one. And it does open up freedoms and opportunities for people at both ends. And so that, it's not all bad, is it? You're very welcome to come back with your research group. With your junior researchers. I think we really welcome giving them the opportunity to engage in the webinar format, which is a good format, which brings you to a lot of people quite effectively. And I do think that the kind of work your group is doing is of considerable interest very widely. So, Jana, thank you again. Colleagues, our next webinar is the redoubtable Michael Healy, who's going to be talking to us next Tuesday on the topic of mapping graduate employability and career development in higher education research. Michael is distinguished by the fact he has one of the best long white beards in higher education research. So you'll have the opportunity to see that in the webinar format on Tuesday. Once again, Jana, thank you, and do come back again, and good luck with your research in future. Bye for now, everyone.
Thank you very much.